Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we drift through the high walls and gilded gates of a family whose name still shimmers with mischief, scandal, and the scent of polished mahogany, the Mitford Sisters. You find yourself standing at the edge of their story in a Britain poised between old-world aristocracy and the crackling modern age, where 6 young women were raised under roofs that creaked with tradition, yet rattled with eccentricity. Imagine the creak of carriage wheels, the cold stone of Oxfordshire manor halls, the faint smell of wet dog and pipe smoke clinging to every velvet curtain. This is no fairy tale. It's a saga of privilege sharpened into weaponry, of young girls trained to curtsy perfectly while secretly plotting to upend the very society they embodied. And you probably won't survive the whirl of champagne scandals and goose-feather duvets without at least raising an eyebrow at their contradictions. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is, because there's something deliciously ironic about falling asleep to stories of people who rarely slept peacefully themselves. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Mitford family lived in the peculiar glow of English aristocracy, that hazy twilight where one could be both deeply wealthy and faintly ridiculous at the same time. You picture yourself slipping into Asthall Manor, a Jacobean house of honey-coloured stone tucked among the rolling hills of Oxfordshire. Its corridors smell faintly of beeswax and damp wool, echoing with the shrieks of children playing some cruel version of hide-and-seek. Lord Redesdale, David Freeman Mitford, trudges through, grumbling about taxes and Bolsheviks, his gruff voice more suited for barking at hounds than tutoring daughters. Beside him, Lady Sydney, known to her children as Muv, orchestrates the household with that strange mix of maternal fussing and lofty detachment, making sure everything looks respectable while privately rolling her eyes at the endless antics. The sisters, 6 daughters and 1 brother, were not educated like other wealthy children. No finishing school in Paris, no polished governess drilling them with French irregular verbs until their heads spun. Instead, they were mostly homeschooled, and homeschooled in that uniquely eccentric English way, encouraged to devour books from the library, left to their own devices in the wild gardens, and nudged gently toward whatever obsession seized their imaginations. One might argue they grew up half feral and half brilliant, a combination that produces either disasters or geniuses, and in this case, both. You sit on the worn rug of the drawing room floor, knees tucked, as the girls practice their society game, their make-believe universe that parodied high society's endless rules. Even as children, they mocked the rituals they were meant to uphold. Nancy, the eldest, sharp-eyed and scathing, invents characters with ridiculous titles, the Duchess of Dimsey, the Earl of Fuddlepip. Her voice cuts like glass as she narrates the imaginary scandals of their fake aristocrats, while the younger sisters howl with laughter, clutching at their pinafores. It's a game that reveals more than it should. These children, destined for London ballrooms, already knew how absurd their world was. The family also had their own secret slang. They called it U language, a code of upper-class words versus non-U language, which exposed you as middle class. For instance, saying lavatory was U, while toilet was not. A tiny distinction, yet for the Mitfords it became an endless source of mockery and identity. You can almost hear them correcting one another with gleeful cruelty. Darling, only shop girls say serviette. Their childhood became a long rehearsal for the satire and sharpness that would one day turn them into cultural lightning rods. The one boy, Tom, was doted upon in that lopsided English manner, where sons inherited titles and expectations, while daughters were left to secure marriages like delicate bargains. He was shipped to Eton, given the education the sisters craved but never received. The girls, by contrast, were left at Asthall to craft their own education from novels, gossip and endless debate. Historians still argue whether this neglect deprived them or liberated them. After all, each sister developed a startlingly individual mind, sharp in different directions. You lean against the oak-panelled wall, watching the Mitfords spill across the gardens, their laughter mingling with the rustle of hedges. Pamela, quiet and steady, coaxes chickens with grain, already dreaming of a pastoral life. Diana, luminous and elegant, turns heads even at 13, her beauty unsettling in its early maturity. Unity, tall and awkward, glowers with a strange intensity, her blue eyes gleaming with some future fanaticism. Jessica, known as Decca, rebels even in play, demanding they form a secret society against the tyranny of parents. Debo, the baby, toddles along in hand-me-down pinafores, absorbing everything, destined to outlive them all. What gives their childhood its particular flavour is the blend of absurdity and rigidity. Lord Redesdale, nicknamed Favre, was notorious for his rants. He distrusted foreigners, detested modern art, and despised communists with an almost comic fervour. Yet he also indulged his daughter's antics, even when he barked at them for being bolshy. Lady Redesdale, Muv, drifted through in her own haze of distraction, alternately doting and absent. The children raised themselves in many ways, their energy bubbling against the confines of expectation. A mainstream fact grounds us here. Astle Manor, their childhood home, was eventually sold in 1926 when the family moved to Swinbrook House. Both estates became legends, remembered not for their architecture but for the chaos of their young inhabitants. Quirky detail? The Mitford children once kept a pet sheep in the house, dressing it in ribbons until it knocked over a priceless vase. It's the sort of anecdote you can't invent. It sums up their mix of grandeur and farce. When the family moved to Swinbrook, the mood shifted. The house was stark, modern, and cold, built in pale stone with stiff symmetry. The girls hated it, calling it a prison. Yet within those walls their teenage years unfurled, full of quarrels, secrets, and grandiose dreams. You imagine walking the echoing corridors at night, hearing Nancy scribble by candlelight in her notebook, Jessica plotting escape to join workers' strikes, Diana rehearsing her smiles before the mirror. Each sister was already rehearsing the roles that would one day shock the world. And through it all ran a thread of money. They were wealthy by ordinary standards, but poor by aristocratic ones, forever juggling appearances. The girls wore hand-me-down gowns and relied on wit to outshine rivals at balls. It gave them a sense of both superiority and insecurity. Too clever for their class, too privileged to abandon it. You sense the contradiction pressing against the velvet drapes like a trapped bird. Evenings at Swinbrook were filled with arguments that would one day harden into ideologies. Nancy teased Unity for her German crushes. Jessica railed about poverty in London while the servants cleared away the silver. Diana dismissed everyone with languid disdain. Pam stayed quiet, fussing over recipes. Debo listened, memorising. You realise that the great conflicts of the 1930s, fascism, communism, aristocratic survival, were already rehearsed at the family table, long before the world exploded. One more tidbit. The Mitfords adored animals, but were terrible caretakers. There were constant tales of escaped goats, dead parrots, and dogs running wild through the house. At one point they dyed a pet dachshund green as a joke. These stories blur the line between cruelty and comedy, showing how insulated they were from consequences. And so you sit in their childhood, half enchanted, half unsettled. The Mitfords are not yet infamous. They are still just siblings, playing at being duchesses and rebels, teasing one another with code words and plotting imaginary futures. But you already sense the sharp edges of destiny. The way their peculiar upbringing, no school, too much freedom, too much expectation, would fling them like arrows in opposite directions. Some would pierce history's heart, some would wound themselves. None would escape unnoticed. As you drift deeper into their world, you realise you're not just wandering a country manor, you're standing at the threshold of a storm. The doors of Swinbrook may seem heavy and still tonight, but behind them 6 young women are preparing in their own chaotic ways to scandalise London, divide a nation, and haunt cultural memory for nearly a century. You lean into the soft flicker of candlelight, and there she is, the eldest of the sisters, Nancy. She stands at the edge of the family dining room like a referee, a mischievous smirk twisting her lips as her siblings argue about politics and poultry. You can almost hear the scratch of her pen, already composing in her mind some wicked parody of the whole evening. She was born in 1904, and as the eldest daughter she inherited not just responsibility, but also the peculiar role of being both insider and outsider within the Mitford tribe. You sense that she relished that position, half mocking, half adoring, never able to look away from the absurd theatre of her family. Nancy's wit was sharper than crystal shattering on a marble floor. She had the uncanny ability to look at high society, tilt her head, and see not glamour but comedy. Her first literary experiments began as she scribbled observations about her family's society game, the private mock royal play acting they invented as children. What started as inside jokes evolved into the skeleton of her future novels. By her 20s, she was already determined to become a writer, even if it meant airing the family's eccentric laundry in public. You picture yourself perched on the edge of her bed at Swinbrook House, where she would lie beneath a pile of blankets, nose poking out, reading Colette and Proust by the flicker of a bedside lamp. Nancy was the sister who drank literature like champagne, desperate to catch the fizz and the ache of modern prose. She turned her longing for something beyond rural Oxfordshire into biting sentences that would later make her a star in London literary circles. Her first novel, Highland Fling, 1931, might not be a classic by most measures, but you can sense the early sparks of her style, a satirical skewering of the English upper classes, their hunting parties, their vapid conversations, their stubborn clinging to traditions already crumbling in the Great Depression. Readers giggled at her caricatures, many of which were drawn straight from Mitford acquaintances who were horrified to see their own ridiculousness immortalised in print. It was with The Pursuit of Love, 1945, and Love in a Cold Climate, 1949, that Nancy truly stepped into the spotlight. These novels, thinly veiled portraits of her own sisters and their circle, captured the dizzy blend of privilege, frivolity and tragedy that defined her generation. You can almost feel her chuckle as she created the character of Uncle Matthew, a blustering aristocrat based unmistakably on her father, Lord Redesdale, whose anti-Bolshevik rants were legendary. In her pages he became both terrifying and laughable, a figure of patriarchal absurdity. Readers adored it, though Favre himself was reportedly not amused. There's something delicious about Nancy's approach to writing. She did not invent so much as transcribe with exaggeration. Every Mitford sister became raw material. Diana's glamour, Jessica's rebellion, Unity's obsession, all of it filtered through Nancy's satirical lens until it glittered as fiction. Historians still argue whether her portrayals were cruel or affectionate. Perhaps they were both, laced with that peculiar Mitford blend of teasing and savagery. As you sip an imaginary cup of tea in her drawing room, Nancy leans over and whispers another bon mot. She was famous for her social observations, often delivered with a half-laugh that softened their sting. When asked about her sister's increasingly outrageous political stances, she quipped, "The great thing is to be absolutely contrary. One sister might fall in love with Hitler, another with communism, another with chickens, and Nancy, ever the commentator, would turn the whole circus into prose." A mainstream fact anchors us here. The Pursuit of Love was one of the best-selling novels in post-war Britain, lifting spirits with its blend of romance and satire at a time when ration books and bomb craters were the daily reality. It proved that laughter could be a salve, even when aimed at the follies of the very class to which Nancy belonged. But then there's the quirky detail. Nancy was notorious for what she called teasing until death. She would torment her sisters with endless practical jokes. Once she filled Diana's bed with cold rice pudding. Another time she locked Debo in a bathroom just to see how long it would take before someone noticed. Her cruelty was rarely malicious. It was a form of performance, a way of testing just how much absurdity life could bear. Nancy's romantic life, however, was less amusing. In 1933 she married Peter Rodd, nicknamed Prod, a man of spectacular laziness and charm. Friends described him as someone who could talk endlessly about politics without ever lifting a finger to act. Nancy adored him at first, but the marriage quickly soured. His affairs, unreliability and indifference left her deeply wounded. Much of her later fiction carries the ache of this disappointment, disguised beneath sparkling dialogue. It is the classic Mitford trick. Turn heartbreak into comedy. Disguise pain with wit. You step into a smoky Paris cafe in the 1930s, where Nancy, separated from Prod, lounges in exile among writers and artists. She adored France, learned the rhythms of the language, and adopted Paris as her spiritual home. Later in life, she would live permanently in the Rue Monsieur, scribbling letters and entertaining visitors with her dazzling, if often acidic, conversation. She was the sister who found her truest self abroad, away from the English country house and its suffocating expectations. Nancy also became a chronicler of the social world in her letters. She corresponded endlessly with Evelyn Waugh, who admired and teased her, and with her sisters, with whom she exchanged a lifetime of biting yet affectionate notes. These letters, later published, reveal more of her than her novels do. Her loneliness, her hunger for connection, her endless appetite for gossip. You find yourself smiling as you imagine her writing in bed, ink blotting onto sheets, pausing only to cackle at her own joke before sending it off. There's a scholarly debate worth lingering on. Did Nancy's satire reinforce the class system she mocked, or did it undermine it? On one hand, her novels immortalise the glamour of the aristocratic world, making it seem irresistibly stylish despite its absurdities. On the other, her relentless mockery exposed its rot. Readers today still puzzle over whether she was complicit or critical, loyal daughter or sly revolutionary. The truth, perhaps, is that she was both, trapped within the gilded cage she so brilliantly described. Nancy's personality in conversation was as flamboyant as her prose. She was famous for her feuds and friendships. She loved Evelyn Waugh, though they quarrelled constantly. She despised some of her sister's choices, especially Diana's fascism and Unity's Hitler worship. Yet she also couldn't resist mining those scandals for material. When Unity attempted suicide in Munich, Nancy responded with dark humour that shocked others, but reflected the family's survival mechanism. If you can laugh, you can endure. Her later years, spent largely in Paris, saw her shift from being merely a novelist to becoming an institution. She was photographed, interviewed, celebrated as the ultimate Mitford wit. You imagine her sitting with a glass of champagne, frail yet still smirking, recounting yet another scandalous anecdote about her family. The great thing about life, she might murmur, is that it provides so much material. A quirky little fact: Nancy loved wearing pink. Bright, unapologetic pink, long before it became fashionable again. She once declared it her armour against dullness. It suited her. Flamboyant, ironic, impossible to ignore. By the time she died in 1973, Nancy had become both a chronicler and caricature of her class. Her novels continue to be read, her letters mined for gossip and insight. She was the sister who transformed the chaos of Mitford life into literature, who made readers laugh even when the world outside was collapsing. And so, as you lean back into your pillow, you sense Nancy's presence most keenly, not in the cold stone of Swinbrook or the glitter of London ballrooms, but in the pages of her novels, where every sentence twinkles with malice and affection. She taught you that life, no matter how absurd or tragic, could always be rewritten as comedy. And in that lesson lies the essence of her sharp quill and her sharper wit. You roll back the velvet curtain of the Mitford story, and there, tucked almost invisibly in the corner, is Pamela. Unlike her sisters, who burst across headlines and gossip columns with political extremism or literary brilliance, Pamela seemed to drift toward the quieter lanes of life, the country paths lined with hedgerows, the rhythms of kitchens and gardens. She was the second eldest sister, born in 1907, and her presence always felt like the steadying hum beneath the family's cacophony. If Nancy was the sharp quill, Diana, the glittering siren, and Unity the flame of fanaticism, Pamela was the gentle cluck of hens in the yard, the aroma of fresh bread rising in an old stone oven. As you picture yourself wandering through Swinbrook House, the air carries that rustic smell of straw and wood smoke. You follow Pamela down to the kitchen garden, where she kneels in a faded apron, hands sunk deep in the soil as she weeds among the lettuces. Unlike her siblings, who cultivated public personas as flamboyant as peacocks, Pamela cultivated real gardens. She cared more about food than fame, more about recipes than rhetoric. When she spoke, her voice carried none of the piercing wit of Nancy or the stormy conviction of Jessica. It was calm, practical, and oddly grounding. From early childhood, Pamela's interests skewed rural. She adored animals, dogs, horses, chickens, though unlike her sister's chaotic treatment of pets, she actually managed to care for them properly. Family lore remembers her training dogs with patience, experimenting with cheese-making, and perfecting roast recipes while her sisters stormed about Europe in ideological crusades. Some cousins joked that Pamela had the soul of a farmer's wife trapped in an aristocrat's daughter, but she embraced the label with a shrug, a mainstream historical fact worth pausing on. Pamela was genuinely skilled in agriculture and food. Later in life, she became something of a gourmet cook, eventually managing a poultry farm and becoming recognised for her culinary expertise. In a family that thrived on notoriety, she carved a reputation based not on scandal, but on roast chickens and soufflés. There's a quirky tidbit too. The poet John Betjeman once described Pamela as the most rural of the Mitfords, and friends remembered her delight in mucking about in Wellington boots while her sisters fretted over politics or publishing contracts. At a time when aristocratic daughters were supposed to shine in drawing rooms, Pamela would happily spend hours learning to pickle vegetables or trying out a new pie recipe. Yet Pamela's quietness was not weakness. She stood her ground in her own way, though less flamboyantly than her sisters. For instance, her marriage in 1936 to Derek Jackson, a brilliant yet eccentric physicist, showed her willingness to pursue a life that didn't fit neat patterns. Jackson was famous for his work on atomic spectroscopy, but he was also flamboyant in his own right, an RAF officer, wealthy, notorious for his multiple marriages and affairs. Historians still argue whether Pamela genuinely loved him, or simply found in him a partner who allowed her the rural domesticity she craved. The marriage, however, was not destined to last. Pamela and Jackson eventually separated, though not before she had carved out years of relative domestic stability. Friends suggested that Pamela tolerated his affairs with stoic calm, focusing instead on her gardens and her culinary experiments. Imagine sitting at her table, the aroma of roast goose filling the air, while Jackson breezes in with another dramatic anecdote from Oxford or the RAF. Pamela listens politely, pours more gravy, and returns to her chickens once the meal is over. Her story might sound tame compared to Diana's prison sentence for fascism or Jessica's communist escapades in America, but Pamela's quiet life was itself a form of resistance. In a family addicted to drama, she refused the spotlight. She chose the overlooked path, and in doing so preserved a kind of sanity that eluded most of her siblings. You can see her later years unfolding like a pastoral painting. After her separation from Jackson, Pamela lived for a time with her companion Giuditta Tomasi, an Italian horsewoman. Their relationship, though discreet, became a significant part of Pamela's life. While never openly described in her lifetime as romantic, such matters being cloaked in euphemism, those who knew them suspected the bond was deeper than friendship. This companionship gave Pamela a sense of balance, a quiet happiness, away from the tabloid glare that consumed her sisters. And still, the Mitford pattern of eccentricity touched her. Family stories recall her showing up to gatherings carrying baskets of eggs as gifts, or lecturing her glamorous sisters about proper kitchen hygiene while they rolled their eyes. She adored country fairs, cheese competitions, and the earthy satisfaction of self-sufficiency. If Diana was a Duchess of Scandal, Pamela was a Duchess of Chickens. The scholarly debate around Pamela centres not on her politics. She largely avoided the extremes of her siblings, but on her significance. Some argue she was overshadowed, her life too ordinary to merit attention. Others counter that her very ordinariness was radical in context. By choosing not to pursue notoriety, she offered a counterpoint that completed the Mitford constellation. Without her, the family saga would be unrelentingly chaotic. Pamela was the quiet note that made the symphony more complex. You imagine her walking across a frost-laced field at dawn, Wellington boots crunching on the grass, a basket looped over her arm. She hums softly, breath visible in the cold air, while far away Nancy scribbles satire, Diana plots political soirees, Jessica rails against capitalism, and Unity writes fawning letters to Hitler. Pamela's world is smaller, but it is also calmer. She cultivates her life like she cultivates her garden, slowly, deliberately, with patience. A little-known, quirky fact. Pamela once bred and exhibited poultry at competitive shows, earning ribbons for her careful attention to breeding stock. It's the sort of detail that might seem laughably small next to Diana's friendship with Mussolini, but in truth it reveals the wide spectrum of Mitford choices, how one family could produce both a poultry enthusiast and a fascist icon. Pamela's later years were marked by a kind of contented obscurity. She continued to cook, garden, and maintain friendships with those who appreciated her down-to-earth humour. Unlike her sisters, she rarely gave interviews or published memoirs. She seemed to understand that her story was best told not in headlines, but in the quiet aroma of baking bread, in the satisfied wag of a dog's tail after supper. When Pamela died in 1994, her passing barely made the news compared to the sensational deaths of her siblings. Yet those who knew her remembered her as the steady one. the anchor who had held the family's chaotic boat just a little more firmly to the shore. And you, tucked beneath your blankets now, realise there is something soothing in her story. She may not have dazzled or horrified the world, but she lived authentically, embracing the simple joys of food, animals, and companionship. It's tempting to laugh at her obsession with chickens and cheeses, but there's also wisdom in it. Pamela reminds you that not every life needs to blaze like fireworks. Some lives are meant to be like hearth fires, steady, glowing, sustaining. And perhaps, in her quiet way, Pamela was the most content of all the Mitfords. As you drift further into her world, you feel the difference in tempo. Her story doesn't roar, it hums, and that hum might just be the softest lullaby of the entire Mitford saga. You close your eyes and hear the rustle of silk in a Mayfair drawing room, the low hum of voices pausing as one figure enters, Diana Mitford. Born in 1910, she shimmered with a beauty so luminous that people compared her to a goddess. Tall, golden-haired, with eyes that seemed to catch every glint of light in the chandelier, Diana was the kind of woman who silenced a room without speaking a word. Even her sisters admitted she was almost unnervingly perfect in looks, and yet, as you watch her glide across that parquet floor, you sense that beauty alone could never contain her. She needed a stage, and she would choose one that would scandalise not just her family, but the entire country. As a young woman, Diana was destined for society triumphs. You imagine her debutante season in London, ballrooms filled with perfume, champagne fizzing in crystal glasses, orchestras swelling as satin shoes skimmed across polished floors. She was the star attraction. Aristocratic mothers nudged their sons toward her, knowing she could elevate a family's fortunes overnight. And indeed, in 1929 she married Brian Guinness, heir to the brewing fortune, a man of wealth, charm, and artistic sensibility. Their marriage was the very picture of glamour, parties attended by artists and writers, evenings at the theatre, a townhouse buzzing with literary lights. For a moment Diana seemed to embody the fairy tale, married to money, admired by poets, dressed in Paris couture. But that shimmering perfection soon revealed cracks. Diana's restless energy, her hunger for something beyond the merely comfortable, drew her away from Brian. She longed for drama, for danger, for ideals that would give shape to her gilded existence. And in the political fever of the 1930s she found her stage, the world of fascism. Imagine standing beside her at a rally, the air sharp with the scent of uniforms and anticipation, the banners snapping in the wind. Diana was captivated by Sir Oswald Mosley, leader of the British Union of Fascists. Mosley was magnetic, handsome, charismatic, with a voice that carried both menace and conviction. Diana fell in love with him, body and soul, despite the fact that he was married at the time. Their affair shocked society, but Diana, wrapped in her own certainty, pressed forward. A mainstream fact grounds us here. In 1936, Diana divorced Brian Guinness and married Mosley. The wedding took place not in London, but in Berlin, in Josef Goebbels' home, with Adolf Hitler himself among the guests. You can almost taste the unease of that champagne toast, the way history would look back at this union as both romantic and catastrophic. Quirky detail: Diana once boasted that Hitler had personally admired her beauty, describing her as the perfect Aryan. Whether he said it or not, she clung to the compliment, repeating it as though it proved her place in the great pageant of destiny. It is one of those Mitford moments where the line between vanity and tragedy blurs into something unsettling. As Lady Mosley, Diana became a figure both adored and despised. She lived in grand style, attending fascist rallies in tailored outfits, giving speeches beside her husband, entertaining Nazi officials when they visited England. To her sisters, she became a kind of emblem. For Nancy, she was raw material for satire. For Jessica, she was the enemy incarnate. Family dinners grew unbearable, debates escalating into furious quarrels. Yet Diana seemed unfazed, convinced she was living on the cutting edge of history. Historians still argue whether Diana truly believed in fascist ideology, or whether she was simply enthralled by Mosley himself. Was it love that drew her deeper into the movement? Or was it the allure of power, of standing close to the great and terrible forces reshaping Europe? Perhaps it was both. What's undeniable is that she was willing to risk everything, her reputation, her friendships, even her liberty, for the man she adored and the cause he preached. And risk it she did. During World War II, as the tide turned against fascism, Diana and Moseley were arrested under Defence Regulation 18B, a law that allowed the British government to detain suspected Nazi sympathisers without trial. Imagine the clang of the prison door behind her, the sudden absence of silk gowns and glittering parties. Diana, once the jewel of Mayfair, now shared a cell. She spent 3 years imprisoned, first in Holloway Prison, then under house arrest at Holloway's Annex. And here comes the curious twist. Her conditions were more comfortable than most prisoners. She was allowed her own furniture, her own clothes, and even occasionally her children's company. Still, the humiliation was sharp. You can almost feel her smoothing the folds of her dress in that cell, refusing to surrender her poise, even as the world branded her a traitor. While Diana languished, her sisters' lives spiralled in opposite directions. Jessica wrote fiery communist tracts in America. Unity, broken after her failed suicide attempt in Germany, withered away under her parents' care. Nancy whispered to British authorities, possibly tipping them off about Diana's activities. The Mitford family, once united in childish games, had become a battlefield of ideologies. After the war, Diana and Moseley were released. They faced a world that regarded them as pariahs, yet they refused to repent. Instead, they retreated to Paris, where they lived in relative comfort, surrounded by a small circle of loyal admirers. You imagine their Paris apartment, decorated in severe modernist style, with Diana hosting salons where politics and gossip mingled with fine wine. She never renounced her past. Instead, she rationalised it, insisting she had chosen the path of strength and beauty. Even in exile, her allure endured. Writers like Evelyn Waugh continued to visit, fascinated by her mixture of charm and menace. She became a subject of endless debate. Was she a tragic romantic swept up by love, or a willing accomplice to one of history's darkest movements? The answer shifts depending on who tells the tale. A quirky anecdote softens the edge. Diana loved fashion with a near-religious devotion. Even in prison, she insisted on proper attire, reportedly scolding wardens when her clothes were not handled carefully. After the war, she continued to attend couture shows in Paris, seated among the glitterati as though nothing had changed. For her, beauty was not frivolous. It was a weapon, a shield, a declaration that she would not be diminished. In her later years, Diana wrote memoirs, attempting to reclaim her narrative. A Life of Contrasts, 1977, presented her version of events, polished and defensive, downplaying the darker chapters while emphasising her devotion to Moseley. Critics were divided. Some admired her candour, others condemned her evasions. But no one could ignore her. Even in old age, with silver hair and softened features, she commanded attention. You lean back now, picturing her final decades in Paris, a woman both revered and reviled, sipping champagne while refusing to apologise. She lived until 2003, long enough to watch her sister's legends cement themselves in popular culture. And even in death, she remained polarising. Some obituaries praised her beauty and loyalty, others branded her a fascist unrepentant. What lingers, as you drift deeper into the story, is the contradiction. Diana dazzled and destroyed in equal measure. She was the woman who could have been merely a celebrated beauty of her age, but chose instead to stand beside dictators, to risk everything for love and ideology. She reminds you that allure can be dangerous, that glamour can cloak ruin, and that sometimes the most dazzling lights cast the darkest shadows. As you breathe softly, you realise her presence is still unsettling even now. Diana teaches you that not every scandal fades with time. Some echo endlessly, as haunting as the rustle of silk in a room that suddenly goes silent. You wake into another corner of the Mitford maze, and hear the energy crackles, restless and defiant. Jessica Lucy Mitford, always Decca to her family, was born in 1917, the fifth Mitford sister, and she grew up glaring at the velvet ropes of privilege as though they were chains. While her siblings preened at debutante balls or flirted with fascism, Jessica plotted escape. You can almost see her sitting cross-legged on the floor at Swinbrook House, a copy of Das Kapital hidden inside a more respectable book, muttering that the world beyond the garden hedges was starving while her family squabbled over poultry. From the beginning, Jessica's rebellion was visceral. She hated the rigid hierarchies of her class, mocked the pomp of aristocracy, and scrawled furious notes about the injustices she read in the newspapers. When Unity announced her devotion to Hitler, Jessica countered by declaring herself a communist. If her sisters wore pearls and fox furs, Jessica would show up in plain skirts and blunt shoes, refusing to play the part of decorative daughter. She was the one who wanted to smash the game board, not just make fun of it like Nancy. One mainstream fact anchors us. Jessica indeed joined the Communist Party of Great Britain as a teenager, aligning herself with a movement that preached equality and revolution. This was not dabbling. It was a commitment. She read Marx and Lenin with the same hunger her sisters devoured fashion magazines. And she dreamed of marching alongside workers rather than waltzing with dukes. The quirky detail, Jessica kept what she called her running away fund, a secret stash of money hidden in a shoebox. While her sisters saved for gowns, she hoarded coins for her escape. She confided her plan to no one at first, but she nursed the fantasy daily. Someday she would bolt, and she did. The moment came in 1937, when Jessica eloped with Esmond Romilly, a nephew of Winston Churchill and a radical communist himself. Imagine the scandal. The aristocratic girl who despised aristocracy running off with a young man who published an anti-fascist newspaper. They fled to Spain, eager to join the fight against Franco in the Spanish Civil War. You feel the dust and heat of Madrid, the air pierced by sirens and gunfire, as Jessica tasted the revolution firsthand. Historians still argue whether Jessica and Esmond truly fought, or merely hovered at the edges of battle, helping where they could, writing, speaking, fundraising. But what matters is that they went. While her sisters courted Hitler in Munich, Jessica stood on the side of the Republican cause, waving the red flag. The family fracture deepened. To their parents, she was not just eccentric, she was traitorous. From Spain, Jessica and Esmond travelled to America, carrying their idealism like a banner. They scraped by on odd jobs, sometimes broke, sometimes hungry, yet exhilarated by their freedom. For Jessica, poverty was not a curse but a badge of authenticity. She preferred cramped apartments and cheap cafes to the suffocating luxury of Mayfair. Imagine her leaning over a diner counter, hair tied back, arguing politics with the same intensity Diana reserved for couture. Their marriage was passionate, chaotic, poor, and brief. In 1941, Esmond joined the Royal Canadian Air Force during World War II. Jessica, pregnant with their second child, stayed behind in Washington. When Esmond's plane was shot down over the North Sea, she was widowed at just 24. Her grief was staggering, but her stubbornness endured. She remained in the United States, carving out a life for herself and her daughter. Mainstream fact again. Jessica became an American citizen, aligning herself not just with the new country, but with its battles. She joined civil rights campaigns, supported labour movements, and later threw herself into the causes of prison reform and consumer rights. She was no idle sympathiser. She marched, organised, wrote, and protested. Quirky tidbit? Jessica had a mischievous sense of humour, much like Nancy's, but with a sharper political edge. She once declared that she loved funerals, calling them a great place to catch up with people. This morbid wit blossomed into her most famous book, The American Way of Death, 1963, a scathing exposé of the funeral industry's exploitative practices. The book became a bestseller, rattled an entire profession, and made Jessica notorious in her adopted homeland. You imagine her typing furiously at a kitchen table, cigarette burning in an ashtray, a cup of black coffee growing cold beside her. She wrote with urgency, her words crackling with indignation and humour. In this, she resembled Nancy. But where Nancy skewered society with satire, Jessica skewered it with journalism. She was in many ways the Mitford who turned rebellion into a career, and yet her letters to her sisters reveal that she never fully escaped the family dynamic. She argued with Diana across oceans, sneered at Unity's madness, teased Debo, and sometimes even softened toward Nancy. Family loyalty tangled with political loathing, an endless tug of war. Historians debate whether Jessica's communism mellowed into liberal reform, or whether she remained a true revolutionary at heart. Certainly her early fervour faded. She was too pragmatic, too humorous, to maintain rigid dogma. But her passion for justice never dimmed. Even late in life she joined protests, waving placards with the same glee she once waved red banners. Her American years gave her a second act. She remarried to Robert Troy Huft, a civil rights lawyer, and together they formed a formidable activist duo. They took on housing discrimination, racial injustice, and abuses of power. Picture them side by side at a rally, Jessica's voice ringing out, laughter mixing with slogans. She was not a relic of 1930s idealism. She was a fighter across decades. Another quirky detail. Jessica loathed pomp and formality so much that she refused to own fine china. Guests at her house were served on plain dishes, often chipped, while the talk soared over politics and gossip. She created a household of deliberate informality, a rebellion against the Mitford stage set of silverware and crystal. Her death in 1996 closed one of the most radical arcs in the Mitford saga. Obituaries called her the Red Sheep of the family, the one who took rebellion further than Nancy's satire or Pamela's quiet refusals. She did not just critique her class, she abandoned it, remade herself, and fought for causes that still resonate. As you breathe slower, drifting deeper into the story, you realise Jessica's legacy is one of energy and defiance. She shows you that rebellion can be a life's work, not just a teenage tantrum. Her voice echoes in every protest chant, every exposé that rattles a corrupt industry, and yet she was still a Mitford, funny, sharp, dramatic, addicted to life's absurdities. If Unity gave herself to a monster, Jessica gave herself to a dream, and though the dream often failed, it gave her purpose, and that purpose made her unforgettable. You lie back, feeling her restless energy fade into your own breath, a reminder that sometimes the best lullabies are not gentle but insistent, a drumbeat of defiance against the dark. You hear the faint creak of a nursery door, and in toddles the youngest of them all, Deborah Vivian Mitford, born in 1920, forever Debo to her family. She is the baby sister, the one who grew up in the shadows of Nancy's sharp wit, Diana's blinding beauty, Unity's obsessions, Pamela's hens, and Jessica's rebellion. In a family where eccentricity was currency, Debo seemed almost plain at first glance. Shy, reserved, not inclined to storm a stage or a barricade, but as you follow her thread through the Mitford tapestry, you see how she became something else entirely. The survivor, the last sister standing, and the unlikely duchess who turned a decaying estate into one of Britain's crown jewels. You imagine her childhood at Swinbrook House, a little girl trailing behind the louder siblings, tugging on Nancy's sleeve, watching Unity tower over her like a Valkyrie. Everyone teased Debo for being uninterested in politics or philosophy. She admitted later that she was hopeless at school, and more fascinated by ponies and magazines than by Marx or Mein Kampf. Yet her apparent simplicity hid a sharp sense of observation. She absorbed everything, like a quiet recorder, and those notes would serve her later when she told her version of the Mitford story. As Debo came of age, the family fractured into warring camps of ideology. Balls and parties continued, but under the surface the world was trembling. Debo, however, navigated all of it with what looked like detachment. While Diana and Unity flirted with fascism, while Jessica bolted toward communism, Debo looked toward marriage. And here the story tilts. She married Lord Andrew Cavendish in 1941, younger son of the Duke of Devonshire. At the time, this seemed a comfortable, if unremarkable, match. But fate would elevate her into a role that suited her more than anyone expected. A mainstream fact sets the stage. Andrew's elder brother, William, was married to Kathleen Kennedy, sister of John F. Kennedy. William was killed in World War II, and with his death Andrew became heir to the dukedom. Thus Debo, once the overlooked Mitford, became the Duchess of Devonshire, mistress of Chatsworth House, one of the grandest estates in England. Now pause and picture Chatsworth as it was in the 1950s, a crumbling pile, beautiful but decayed, with leaking roofs, peeling wallpaper, and a tax bill so monstrous it threatened to swallow the entire fortune. Many families sold their estates in those years, unable to maintain them under modern burdens. Debo, however, rolled up her sleeves. Instead of sinking under the weight of heritage, she reinvented it. Quirky tidbit, Debo adored chickens. Yes, like Pamela, she had a fondness for poultry, and she was known to attend glamorous functions still wearing Wellington boots caked with mud. At Chatsworth, she began selling eggs and local produce alongside opening the house to tourists. What seemed eccentric at first became revolutionary. She pioneered the idea of stately homes as attractions, blending heritage, commerce, and hospitality. Visitors flocked, revenue poured in, and Chatsworth not only survived but thrived. Imagine wandering through the great halls, the marble statues gleaming once again, the fireplaces roaring. Tourists shuffle with guidebooks, marvelling at treasures that, a generation earlier, might have been auctioned off. And somewhere, Debo strolls briskly, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp for dust, ready to adjust the flower arrangements or scold a lazy gardener. She turned aristocratic responsibility into entrepreneurial artistry. Debo's personality was part of her success. She was practical, witty, and disarmingly direct. Unlike Diana's icy hauteur or Nancy's barbed satire, Debo's humour was warm, even self-deprecating. She once declared, "I'm not clever, but I can tell if a room needs flowers." That line became her hallmark, modesty masking shrewd instinct. She knew what people wanted when they visited a grand house, and she gave it to them with charm. Historians still argue whether Debo's reinvention of Chatsworth was genius or simply luck. Did she ride the wave of post-war tourism, or did she create the model others followed? Either way, her impact was undeniable. She transformed Chatsworth into a profitable living estate rather than a dusty relic. Today, it stands as a testament not just to aristocratic endurance but to one woman's vision. Her links to the Kennedys added a dash of glamour. Through Kathleen Kennedy's marriage to her brother-in-law, Debo brushed shoulders with American royalty. She met John F. Kennedy, attended family gatherings, and later cherished her letters from Jackie. Yet she never pretended to be their equal in intellect or politics. Debo remained resolutely herself, preferring conversations about livestock over statecraft. Quirky fact, she was obsessed with Elvis Presley. Yes, the Duchess of Devonshire adored the King of Rock and Roll. She collected memorabilia, visited Graceland, and spoke of Elvis with girlish enthusiasm. Visitors to Chatsworth sometimes found this baffling. A duchess who knew as much about poultry breeds as she did about Elvis singles. But it made her irresistible. She was not aloof, she was real. Debo also wrote books, though not in the searing satirical mode of Nancy or the investigative journalism of Jessica. Instead, she wrote memoirs, cookbooks, and histories of Chatsworth, filled with anecdotes delivered in her brisk, humorous tone. Reading her words is like walking beside her through the estate, hearing her laugh about the absurdities of aristocratic life while also admiring its beauty. Her marriage to Andrew was not without strain. He struggled with alcoholism, and their union bore the weight of tragedy as well as triumph. Yet Debo remained steadfast, pragmatic, and loyal. In later years she was seen as the rock of the Devonshire family, the steady duchess who carried Chatsworth into a new era. The scholarly debate about Debo focuses on her role as both traditionalist and innovator. Was she preserving aristocracy, or reinventing it for a democratic age? Did her tourist-friendly Chatsworth democratise access to beauty, or did it simply repackage privilege for modern consumption? As with all the Mitfords, the truth lies somewhere between. You imagine her in her final years, silver-haired, brisk, still presiding over Chatsworth with the same energy. She outlived all her siblings, the last Mitford sister alive when she died in 2014 at age 94. By then she was a national treasure, beloved not for scandal or ideology, but for her down-to-earth humour and practical brilliance. A quirky closing detail, she once admitted that her proudest achievement was selling more than 1 million postcards at Chatsworth's gift shop. Not the glamour, not the Kennedy connection, not the Duchess's title, but the postcards. It summed her up perfectly. Practical, wry, and always with an eye on what actually worked. As you sink into your pillow, Debo's story feels oddly soothing. She represents survival, resilience, the ability to take something crumbling and make it thrive again. While her sisters burned bright and self-destructed in flames of ideology and scandal, Debo tended the fire, kept it going, and warmed generations. You feel the hum of that fire now, steady, low, reassuring. In the long tale of the Mitfords, Debo's reinvention offers the softest landing. A reminder that even in the most outrageous families, someone must keep the roof from falling in. You close your eyes and picture a long oak dining table at Swinbrook, its wax surface gleaming under candlelight, bowls of soup steaming, silver spoons clinking. And yet, the air is thick with tension. The Mitford Sisters, who once spent hours inventing parodies of dukes and duchesses in their society game, are now older, sharpened by their convictions. Each has chosen a side in the great ideological divide of the 1930s and 1940s, and those sides do not fit together. What was once teasing is now accusation. What was once laughter is now fury. You feel the chill of silence after one of Nancy's sarcastic barbs, the flush on Jessica's cheeks as she calls Diana a traitor, the storm gathering as Unity slams her fist in defence of Hitler. Family dinner became a microcosm of world politics. To your left, Diana sparkles with Mosley's rhetoric, her beauty repurposed as propaganda. Across from her sits Jessica, clutching pamphlets about workers' strikes, her voice rising as she describes hunger marches in London. Unity, face glowing with zeal, quotes Hitler as if quoting scripture. Nancy, perched at the end of the table, records it all in her head, preparing to transmute the madness into satire. Pamela keeps her eyes on her plate, muttering about chickens. Debo, the youngest, tries to vanish into the woodwork, her fork scraping faintly against china. A mainstream fact sets the context. By the mid-1930s, Europe was polarised between the rise of fascism and the spread of communism. The Mitfords mirrored this division in extreme form. Diana and Unity became the glamorous faces of fascist sympathy in Britain, while Jessica declared allegiance to communism, ultimately leaving for Spain and America. Their father, Lord Reddersdale, leaned toward fascist sympathies himself, while their mother drifted between concern and indulgence. The family was split, sometimes literally. Letters, silences, cold shoulders, by politics that had become personal. Quirky tidbit. Even in the midst of these ideological wars, the sisters couldn't resist their peculiar humour. Jessica and Unity once argued so violently about politics that Jessica stormed out of the room, only for Unity to scribble commie on her pillow in lipstick. Jessica retaliated by drawing a swastika on Unity's shoes. Their battles veered between comedy and cruelty, proof that even world-shaking ideologies couldn't erase the childishness that ran through their veins. Historians still argue whether the Mitfords exaggerated their own divisions for dramatic effect. After all, the sisters relished being outrageous. Could it be that their quarrels were as much performance as principle? Or did the family truly become a civil war, where every gathering was a battlefield? Accounts differ, but what's certain is that their splits reflected the fractures of the age. Imagine Unity returning from Munich, cheeks flushed with excitement after dining with Hitler, trying to convince her family that war was unnecessary if only Britain would ally with Germany. Jessica shouts back that she's deluded, that fascism is murder. Nancy sighs dramatically and says, "Really, darling, the only thing worse than Hitler is having to hear about him at dinner." Diana, aloof, polishes her nails and murmurs about Mosley's vision for Britain. Their parents shake their heads, torn between exasperation and disbelief. When war finally came in 1939, those tensions exploded. Jessica, already in America, wrote bitter letters condemning Diana and Unity. Nancy, who had grown increasingly anti-fascist, even passed information about Diana's activities to authorities, helping ensure her sister's imprisonment under Defence Regulation 18B. Think of that. One sister effectively responsible for another being locked away. It's the kind of fracture that rarely heals. Unity's attempted suicide in Munich only added to the chaos. The family rallied to nurse her, but the bitterness never faded. Diana, imprisoned alongside Mosley, felt betrayed not just by her country, but by her own sister Nancy. Jessica refused to speak to Diana or Unity at all, considering them enemies rather than siblings. Pamela, pragmatic as ever, muttered that they were all ridiculous. Debo watched in silence, trying to keep some semblance of connection, while everything shattered around her. The war years were like a storm hammering the Mitfords from every side. Imagine the headlines. One sister detained as a Nazi sympathiser, another married to a communist activist, another recovering from a bullet in her skull after pledging herself to Hitler, another publishing satirical novels mocking aristocrats while secretly aiding the French resistance with intelligence. The tabloids couldn't have invented a more sensational family if they tried, yet even amid the fractures, there were moments of reluctant tenderness. Jessica, despite her hatred of Diana's politics, once admitted that she couldn't quite stop thinking of her as the glamorous sister she'd admired in childhood. Nancy, sharp-tongued, still sent books and small gifts to Unity in her broken state. The Mitfords could never completely sever their bonds, no matter how fiercely they quarrelled. It was as if their childhood game of society had become real life, but they still shared the same stage, bound by blood and memory. Quirky anecdote. After the war, when Unity was still alive but mentally impaired, the sisters sometimes referred to her as Bood, short for Boodledidge, her childhood nickname. They whispered about her with an odd mixture of affection and mockery, as though even tragedy could not completely strip away their habit of nicknaming and teasing. It's unsettling, but it also shows how the family's humour was their survival mechanism. The scholarly debate continues. Did the Mitfords reflect broader British society, or were they unique in their extremities? Many families were divided by politics in the 1930s, but few had daughters literally toasting Hitler while another waved the red flag in Spain. Some argue that the Mitfords became a distorted mirror of the age, their eccentricities magnifying the fractures of their class. Others see them as outliers, a family so eccentric that their story can't be generalised. Either way, their feuds became legend. You imagine the sisters as chess pieces scattered across the board of Europe, Diana in prison, Unity in her sickbed, Jessica in America, Nancy in Paris, Pamela in her garden, Debo at Chatsworth. Each move opposed the others, each choice drew the lines deeper, and yet, if you lean close, you can hear their shared laughter, from childhood echo faintly, like a ghost of unity that never fully vanished. As you exhale, you realise the tragedy of the Mitfords is not only in their choices, but in the way those choices tore the bonds of family. Sisters became enemies, dinner tables became battlegrounds, childhood games became adult wars, and yet, despite it all, they remained bound together in the world's imagination, not just as individuals, but as a constellation of extremes, forever clashing, forever unforgettable. You drift now into the glow of chandeliers and the perfumed thick air of London's grand hotels in the 1920s and 1930s. This is the London season, the glittering parade of balls, dances and endless dinners, where young aristocratic daughters were presented to society like jewels in a velvet case. For the Mitford sisters, the season was not merely a rite of passage, it was a stage, a proving ground, and in their case, a circus. You can almost hear the rustle of satin skirts as the girls step nervously into drawing rooms, their eyes scanning for princes, politicians or poets, each with a different agenda hidden beneath her silk bodice. Picture the scene at Claridge's Hotel, ballroom doors flung wide, violins tuning as the first notes of a waltz tremble through the crowd. Rows of young women, cheeks powdered, hair lacquered, stand beside their mothers, hoping to catch a glance from a suitable match. Mothers flutter their fans like nervous birds, scanning the room for dukes and barons. Into this stage step the Mitfords, 6 sisters who, even as debutantes, refused to play the role properly. Nancy, eldest, smirked at the absurdity of it all. She whispered biting commentary into her fan, mocking the size of hats, the stiffness of manners. Pamela shifted awkwardly, more comfortable thinking of recipes than partners. Diana, dazzling beyond compare, shone in silk, every eye following her as she danced with the confidence of a born queen. Unity, towering and awkward, attracted attention not for grace, but for sheer eccentricity, sometimes blurting out shocking remarks mid-dance. Jessica, rolling her eyes, plotted ways to escape, her disdain so obvious it made her partners sweat. And little Debo, wide-eyed, absorbed it all with the innocent fascination of the youngest, storing memories that she would later recount with humour. A mainstream fact, during the interwar years the London season was still a significant social institution. It functioned as a marriage market for Britain's elite, ensuring alliances of money and title. For the Mitfords, it was both opportunity and comedy. Diana, with her beauty, was the star of multiple seasons, while Nancy's wit and sharp tongue became notorious in salons. Quirky tidbit? The Mitfords often used their private slang, Mitfordese, even at balls. They might whisper "you" or "non-you" to mock someone's word choice, giggling as if sharing a secret language in the middle of stiff formality. Once, Unity shocked a dance partner by suddenly exclaiming, "Do you know I worship Hitler?" Not the sort of comment expected during a polite foxtrot. You can picture the poor man fumbling, the orchestra obliviously playing on. Historians still argue whether the Mitfords' irreverence was deliberate rebellion, or simply instinctive eccentricity. Did they set out to undermine the season, or were they simply incapable of bowing to convention? Either way, their presence turned what was supposed to be predictable ritual into unpredictable theatre. The season was also about spectacle beyond the ballrooms. Tea parties at the Ritz, Ascot races, garden fetes. Imagine Diana in a wide-brimmed hat at Ascot, photographers clamouring, while Jessica sulked and muttered about the exploitation of stable boys. Nancy teased everyone, writing afterward in her diary lines that would later resurface in her novels. The Mitfords thrived on contradiction, and nowhere was this clearer than when they collided with the rigid choreography of aristocratic display. The pressure to marry was relentless. Suitors came and went, often more dazzled by the family's eccentric reputation than by dowries. Diana's marriage to Brian Guinness was the ultimate season triumph, a glittering match of beauty and wealth. Nancy, by contrast, married later and less happily to Peter Rodd, chosen more for his charm than his reliability. Jessica rejected the entire process, running away instead. Pamela married a physicist, surprising those who expected her to wed a country squire. Debo the baby secured her duchess's crown by marrying into the Cavendish family. Each sister's trajectory reflected her stance toward the season. Embrace, reject, or twist it to her own design. At those grand balls you sensed the contrast between the polished surface and the storm beneath. The chandeliers sparkle, champagne flows, laughter rises, but within each Mitford heart, rebellion brews. Diana gazes past her partners, already drawn toward Mosley's fire. Unity stares dreamily, not at British officers, but toward fantasies of Hitler. Jessica counts the hours until she can bolt to Spain. Nancy scribbles mental notes for the satire that will make her famous. Even in the gilded glow the fractures are forming. Quirky anecdote. When presented at court, as debutantes were required to do, the Mitfords treated the ritual with gleeful irreverence. One reportedly tripped during her curtsy to the king, another whispered jokes about the monarch's outfit. Their mother despaired, but their reputation for mischief only grew. Society, half appalled and half amused, leaned in closer. The scholarly debate about the season itself echoes here. Was it a dying ritual already outdated by the interwar years, or was it still the beating heart of British aristocracy? For the Mitfords, it was both. A stage that elevated them into the public eye, and a parody they gleefully performed until it cracked. As you drift among the candlelit halls, you realise the London season was less about dancing for the Mitfords, and more about declaring themselves, each in her own eccentric way. They were presented to society, yes, but they also presented society back to itself in exaggerated, mocking form. The season wanted polished jewels, it got firecrackers, and so you leave the ballroom, the echo of violins fading. Outside, the London night hums with taxis and street lamps, and the Mitfords scatter into the darkness, each carrying away her own interpretation of what it meant to be young, female and aristocratic, in an age that was itself teetering between tradition and upheaval. You step now from the glitter of the London ballroom into the quieter, more intimate rooms where the real dramas of the Mitford sisters unfolded. For all their political passions and eccentricities, they were also creatures of love and longing, capable of deep devotion, reckless affairs and betrayals that cut across the grain of family. If their politics split them into enemies, their romances tangled them into knots. You can almost hear the sigh of satin sheets, the clink of champagne glasses left half empty on a dressing table, the whispered arguments that outlived the waltz. Nancy, the eldest, was first to navigate the dangerous waters of love. Her marriage to Peter Rodd, Prod, as everyone called him, was a disaster almost from the start. At first he was charming, witty, a man of promise, but his charm concealed laziness and irresponsibility. Nancy, who longed for romance and stability, found herself abandoned for Prod's mistresses, his gambling, his endless flings. Their marriage became a battlefield of disappointment, and Nancy turned her grief into sharp satire. Her novels are full of thinly veiled versions of Prod, the charming cad, the man who promises and fails. She once joked that he was the original model for all hopeless husbands in literature. Beneath the jest, though, was heartbreak. Pamela's love life seemed quieter but had its complexities. Her marriage to Derek Jackson, the physicist, was unconventional. He was brilliant, wealthy, but also famously unfaithful. Derek married 6 times, yet Pamela remained one of the few who managed to live with him in relative calm for a stretch. Some say she tolerated his infidelities with stoic humour, choosing to focus on her gardens and kitchens rather than his affairs. After their separation, she built a different kind of partnership with Giuditta Tomasi, her Italian companion, which many believe was romantic, though never publicly described as such. Pamela's life was defined not by scandal, but by the quiet reinvention of love, shaped less by vows than by companionship and practicality. Then comes Diana, whose romances burned like comets. Her first marriage to Brian Guinness was dazzling. Wealth, parties, intellectual circles, a match straight from a society fairy tale. But even as she played hostess to artists and poets, Diana was already restless. Her affair with Oswald Mosley, married at the time, notorious for his charisma, was a betrayal not only of Brian, but of the polite society that had placed her on a pedestal. When she divorced Brian and married Mosley in Goebbels' home, with Hitler present, she shocked the world. It was both romance and political allegiance, desire tangled with ideology. Brian never forgave her, though he remained connected to her through their children. Her betrayal of him became one of the defining scandals of the age. Unity's romantic life is almost too strange to categorise. She had no great marriage, no long-term partner, but instead an obsession with Hitler that functioned like love. She followed him, flattered him, devoted herself to him with the intensity of a lover. Some historians argue she was in love with him, not politically but personally, idolising him as others might idolise a movie star. Was it romance, delusion, or fanaticism? Perhaps all three. But for Unity, Hitler was the great unrequited love of her life, and when war destroyed the possibility of that connection, she destroyed herself. Jessica, in contrast, lived romance as rebellion. Her elopement with Esmond Romilly was more than a love story. It was a manifesto. She chose him not only because she adored him, but because he represented everything her family despised: communism, activism, anti-fascism. Their flight to Spain was part honeymoon, part political theatre. They lived in poverty, fought side by side, raised a child in cramped quarters, all of it a rejection of Mitford privilege. Esmond's death in World War II devastated Jessica, leaving her with the lifelong scar of early widowhood. Later, she found stability with Robert Treuhaft, her second husband, with whom she built a partnership grounded in activism and mutual respect. Yet her letters reveal that she never fully forgot Esmond, the wild young man she ran away with at 19. Debo, the youngest, seemed to chart the most conventional course, yet her love story carried its own twists. Her marriage to Andrew Cavendish began in the shadow of his elder brother's prominence. Debo never expected to become Duchess. When Andrew's brother was killed in the war, their marriage transformed overnight, burdened with the weight of Chatsworth and a dukedom. Debo proved loyal, pragmatic, affectionate, even as Andrew wrestled with alcoholism and grief. Their marriage endured through tragedy, and she later spoke of him with both tenderness and honesty. Among the sisters, hers was perhaps the most enduring example of love as work, as daily reinvention rather than whirlwind. Mainstream fact: the Mitford Sisters' romances were tracked relentlessly by newspapers, feeding a public hungry for tales of aristocratic scandal. Every marriage, every affair, every divorce was reported as though it were a chapter in a serialised novel. Their love lives made them celebrities as much as their politics. Quirky tidbit: the sisters often mocked each other's romantic choices with merciless glee. Nancy called Diana's devotion to Mosley the longest crush in history. Jessica joked that Pamela cared more about her chickens than her husband. Debo once quipped that she never had a chance at glamour because by the time it was her turn to debut, her sisters had used up all the headlines. Their humour kept their rivalries sharp, even in the most intimate matters. Historians still argue how much of the sisters' romantic choices were personal and how much were performances of identity. Did Diana choose Mosley out of true love, or because he embodied the rebellion she craved? Did Jessica run to Esmond for passion, or as a gesture of political escape? Did Pamela's domestic partnerships reflect quiet defiance of convention, or simply her practicality? Love, for the Mitfords, was never simple. It was always tied to politics, to class, to performance. As you picture them, you see 6 women navigating not just the tug of the heart, but the pull of history. Nancy, heartbroken yet laughing through satire. Pamela, steady in her own quiet partnerships. Diana, glamorous and destructive in her passion. Unity, consumed by obsession. Jessica, turning love into revolution. Debo, building loyalty into a fortress. Their romances were as extreme as their ideologies, and just as unforgettable. You lie back now, and the murmur of their whispered conversations fills the dark. Love declared too soon, love betrayed, love remembered in fragments. For the Mitfords, romance was never a quiet affair. It was another battlefield, and sometimes another comedy. You drift now into a quieter room, the scratch of nibs on paper echoing louder than the thud of marching boots. The Mitford sisters, as divided as they were by politics and love, shared one common weapon: words. Whether penned in novels, pamphlets, letters, or articles, their sentences travelled further than their footsteps, carrying their quarrels and convictions into salons, newsstands, and living rooms across continents. Each sister who wrote did so in a different voice, yet all shared the same family hallmark: wit sharp enough to cut, exaggeration brazen enough to sting, and a gift for performance on the page that blurred the line between comedy and propaganda. Start with Nancy, the family's literary star. Her novels, The Pursuit of Love, Love in a Cold Climate, and others, were not merely entertainment, but barbed commentary. With every line she satirized her world, embedding portraits of her sisters and parents, thinly disguised yet unmistakable. Readers laughed at Uncle Matthew's rants without realizing they were reading a caricature of Lord Reddersdale himself. But Nancy did more than mock. She shaped how the public perceived her family. Through her novels, the Mitfords became not just society figures but characters, half-fictionalized archetypes. If Diana wanted to be remembered for glamour, or Jessica for rebellion, Nancy ensured they would also be remembered as fodder for comedy. Her fiction was her propaganda, gentle on the surface, corrosive underneath. Pamela wrote far less, yet even she dipped her pen into the family narrative. Recipes, food notes, and occasional letters from her became part of the archive of Mitford voices. Where Nancy wielded satire, Pamela offered domestic pragmatism, reminding the world that not all Mitfords were extreme. In a family addicted to hyperbole, her quiet writing style, focused on hens and cheese, stood as a different kind of propaganda, the propaganda of normalcy. Diana, by contrast, turned words into weapons of ideology. Alongside Mosley, she helped edit and contribute to the British Union of Fascists publications. Her elegance made her dangerous. When she wrote in defence of fascism, readers were tempted to see glamour rather than menace. Imagine her seated at a polished desk in Paris after the war, crafting her memoir A Life of Contrasts. It was her attempt to reclaim her story, to frame herself not as traitor, but as loyal wife, principled aristocrat, misunderstood visionary. Every sentence was designed to rehabilitate her image. Critics scorned her evasions, but admirers clung to her unapologetic tone. Memoir became her propaganda, the final stage for a woman who refused to repent. Unity, though broken after her suicide attempt, had earlier filled letters with effusions about Hitler, sending notes home that gushed with devotion. She scribbled swastikas, copied speeches, and spread her enthusiasm among friends. To read her words now is unsettling, like glimpsing the diary of someone lost in delusion, each sentence trembling with obsession. Her propaganda was less structured than Diana's, but no less fervent. The raw prose of infatuation turned into ideology. Jessica, meanwhile, stormed into print with political fire. Her articles and later her books carried the cadences of a revolutionary pamphlet sharpened by humour. In America she found her voice as a muckraker, exposing hypocrisy in industries from funerals to prisons. Her American Way of Death became a landmark, its sentences crisp, scornful, and funny even as they accused an entire industry of exploitation. Her writing combined activism and entertainment, making serious critique palatable for wide audiences. This too was propaganda, though aimed at reform rather than dogma, the propaganda of social justice cloaked in wit. Debo, the youngest, picked up her pen later in life, producing memoirs that charmed rather than shocked. Wait for Me, and her books on Chatsworth radiated warmth and self-deprecation. Her propaganda was of a softer kind, the careful branding of Chatsworth as both a grand estate and a welcoming home. She wrote of chickens, Elvis Presley, and postcards with as much affection as she did of dukes and duchesses. If Diana used prose to justify and Jessica to attack, Debo used prose to invite. A mainstream fact grounds us here. Between them, the sisters produced a vast archive of writing, novels, memoirs, letters, journalism, that has become the chief way historians and readers know them. Their letters alone, published in collections, fill volumes chronicling not just their lives but the century itself. Through those words they became interpreters of their own myth. Quirky tidbit. Their letters often contained invented slang, full of code words unintelligible to outsiders. They wrote hons for themselves, counter-hons for those outside their circle. They mocked language as much as they mocked society. In one letter, Nancy teased Jessica by writing in faux communist jargon. In another, Jessica replied by parodying fascist slogans. Their correspondence became its own performance, propaganda as sibling theatre. Historians still argue whether the Mitfords' words should be read as historical documents or as literary performances. Were Nancy's novels reliable portraits, or were they too satirical to be trusted? Was Diana's memoir candid or calculated to deceive? Was Jessica's exposé journalism or propaganda in its own right? The debate reflects the slipperiness of the sisters themselves. They never gave straightforward truths, only entertaining versions of them. Imagine a post-war evening in Paris. Diana sits at her desk, rewriting her life with calm elegance. Across the channel, Jessica bangs on a typewriter in Oakland, turning rage into witty prose. In London, Nancy revises a scene that will make her father immortal as a comic ogre. Debo, years later, jots notes for a cookbook that will sell at Chatsworth's gift shop. The ink flows in different directions, but the effect is the same. The Mitfords conquer not just drawing rooms, but the printed page. You realise, lying in the dark, that the sisters' true battleground was never just politics or romance. It was narrative. Each one wrote her version, fought to control her story, spun her life into a tale others would read and believe. Propaganda for the Mitfords was not only about ideology, it was about family myth-making. They turned their lives into literature, and literature into legend. And so, the scratch of their pens lingers in your ears, a lullaby of wit, deceit, passion and performance. The ink has dried, but the words remain, still shaping how you see them, still dividing readers into admirers and critics. Their propaganda worked. You cannot look away. You roll now into the post-war years, and the air has changed. The bombs have stopped, the uniforms are folded away, and Britain, scarred and rationed, is trying to reassemble itself. Yet even as rubble is cleared from London streets, the Mitford sisters are still there, though not as politicians or martyrs, but as celebrities. Newspapers cannot resist them. Magazines splash their faces across pages, sometimes in admiration, more often in ridicule. They have become more than women. They are symbols, caricatures, punchlines, and legends all at once. Imagine picking up a glossy magazine in the late 1940s. On one page you see Diana, impeccably dressed in Paris, emerging from her exile with Oswald Mosley. The caption calls her the beauty who loved the wrong man. On another page, Jessica is quoted from America, railing against injustice, her hair pinned back, her voice ringing with certainty. Nancy appears in reviews for her novels, praised for her wit. Her sentences so sharp they feel like champagne bubbles cutting your tongue. Unity is still whispered about, a ghost of a woman, the bullet in her head making her a tragic spectacle. Pamela is mentioned briefly. The chicken-fancying sister, a novelty act compared to her siblings. Debo smiles from photographs at Chatsworth called The Duchess Who Likes Elvis. Each sister reduced to a brand, a mainstream fact. By the 1950s, the Mitfords were fixtures of both popular culture and serious commentary. Their names appeared in newspapers from London to New York, sometimes in political context, sometimes in society columns. They had become shorthand for eccentric aristocracy, their surname a headline in itself. The quirky detail? Reporters often struggled to tell them apart. Once, a journalist mistook Pamela for Nancy and quoted her as saying something Nancy never would have. Another time, Debo was asked about fascism in an interview, when she'd never been near politics. The sisters themselves teased the confusion, sometimes deliberately swapping details in interviews. They understood their celebrity was partly a circus, and they leaned into the performance. Historians still argue whether the Mitfords were mocked because of their politics, or because of their gender. Would 6 brothers, equally divided between fascism and communism, have been treated as amusing rather than threatening? Were the sisters dismissed as silly girls, even when their choices shook history? Some say the press indulged them because they were women. Glamorous, quotable, entertaining. Others counter that the mockery was punishment. a way of containing women who had dared to leap into politics, art and scandal too boldly. Imagine Nancy in Paris, reading a newspaper review that praises her wit while mocking her sisters. She laughs, but her laughter is brittle. She knows she has shaped their public image as much as anyone, but she also knows the jokes can sting. Diana reads the same piece and fumes, calling the journalist ignorant. Jessica, across the Atlantic, writes a letter full of derision, declaring that the bourgeois press is worthless anyway. Debo shrugs, pours tea, and goes back to planning her next Chatsworth exhibit. Pamela mutters that they should all be ignored. Even mocked, the sisters cannot escape the fascination. Quirky anecdote. Nancy once posed for a photo shoot and insisted on including her dog in the picture, only to have the dog pee on the photographer's leg mid-session. She later claimed it was the best review she'd ever had. It's the kind of anecdote the press adored, proof that even when celebrated, the Mitfords courted absurdity. Diana and Moseley in particular became the focus of both celebrity and ridicule. To some, they were glamorous exiles, hosting salons in Paris with the lingering aura of aristocratic elegance. To others, they were relics of fascism, dangerous clowns to be watched but mocked. They lived in comfort, yet their reputations never recovered. Every appearance in the press reminded the public of betrayal. Jessica, by contrast, rode celebrity differently. In America, her books made her a star in progressive circles. The American Way of Death landed her on television, newspapers quoting her gleefully as she skewered the funeral industry. She became the Mitford who succeeded in reinventing herself, turning family notoriety into a platform for activism. Yet even she was sometimes treated as a curiosity. The aristocrat turned communist, the Duchess's daughter turned muckraker. The paradox was irresistible to editors. Nancy's fame reached its height in the same years. Her novels were adapted, quoted, and adored. She became the Mitford with literary gravitas, the one critics took seriously. Yet even she was sometimes dismissed as gossipy or frivolous. Her satire reduced to society comedy, when it was in fact sharp social critique. Celebrity was always double-edged. It brought admiration, but also trivialization. Pamela, despite avoiding politics and publishing, was not free from mockery. Journalists labelled her the rural Mitford, a punchline for preferring hens to headlines. Yet in that mockery was also affection. She became the palate cleanser in Mitford coverage, proof that not all the sisters were incendiary. Debo's celebrity grew steadily as she reinvented Chatsworth. She became beloved as the down-to-earth Duchess, often photographed with livestock, interviewed about everything from royal visits to Elvis Presley. People chuckled at her quirks, but also admired her pragmatism. Unlike Diana, she wore her celebrity lightly, transforming ridicule into charm. The scholarly debate here is whether the sisters manipulated their celebrity or were victims of it. Did Nancy deliberately turn her sisters into characters to secure her novel's success? Did Jessica cultivate her image as the red sheep to sell her books? Did Diana accept mockery as the price for loyalty to Moseley? Or did the press simply devour them, reshaping them into caricatures beyond their control? The truth lies, as always, in the muddle. The Mitfords both played the game and were played by it. Quirky tidbit again. In later years, Debo kept clippings of articles that mocked her and pasted them into scrapbooks. She laughed at the absurd headlines, treating them as souvenirs. "At least they spell my name right," she once quipped. As you drift further, you realise the paradox of their celebrity. They were mocked and adored in equal measure, but they were never ignored. They fascinated because they embodied contradictions, glamorous yet scandalous, witty yet foolish, privileged yet extreme. They were celebrities not in spite of their contradictions, but because of them. And so, the image lingers, newsstands stacked with papers, the Mitford name bold in headlines, readers shaking their heads, laughing, arguing, gossiping. The sisters, wherever they were, in Paris, in America, in Derbyshire, in Oxfordshire, felt the pull of that gaze. They were both trapped and exalted by it. The laughter you hear now, faint and echoing, is the world's. The sisters had become a spectacle, and even when mocked, they ensured no one could look away. The guns fell silent in 1945, but the echoes of war continued to rattle through the Mitford family like loose panes in a drafty manor window. You imagine yourself stepping into those years when Europe staggered out of rubble and rationing, and the sisters, each battered, exiled or scandal-stained, had to decide what came next. For some, reinvention meant survival. For others, it meant clinging stubbornly to what they already were. Post-war Britain was no longer a playground for debutantes. It was a land of austerity and rebuilding. Yet the Mitfords, true to form, refused to fade quietly into obscurity. Nancy was perhaps the quickest to seize her second act. Paris called to her like a lover, and she answered. You can see her now in a left-bank apartment, drapes half-drawn, cigarette in hand, ink-stained pages stacked beside her bed. The war had aged her, left her with illness and loneliness, but she turned those raw edges into prose. The Pursuit of Love came out in 1945, a novel that lifted spirits weary of bomb craters and ration queues. Readers devoured her satire and romance, and suddenly Nancy was not just a Mitford sister, but a literary star. In the years that followed, she became a fixture in Parisian salons, hosting evenings where gossip, wit and debate flowed as freely as wine. A mainstream fact, Nancy's novels were not only critical successes, but also commercial hits, reprinted and translated, keeping her in the public eye until her death in 1973. She carved out a genuine career, no longer defined only by her family name. Quirky tidbit. In Paris, Nancy developed a reputation for being both charming and terrifying. Friends joked that visiting her was like going to confession. You emerged entertained, but also skewered. She once scolded a guest for bringing flowers, declaring, "They'll only die and make me depressed." That mixture of comedy and cruelty kept her social circle buzzing. Diana's reinvention was more complicated. Released from Holloway in 1943, she and Mosley slipped into semi-exile in Paris after the war. Their reputations in Britain were beyond repair. Fascism was no longer a fashionable flirtation, but a crime soaked in blood. Yet in Paris, among sympathetic aristocrats and a few loyal admirers, they maintained a semblance of grandeur. Diana reinvented herself as a hostess once more, presiding over elegant dinners where politics and art mingled uneasily. She published A Life of Contrasts in 1977, a memoir designed to justify her choices and present herself as misunderstood rather than monstrous. It was her way of controlling the narrative, of insisting she had loved and remained loyal, and that loyalty was her defining virtue. Historians still argue whether Diana's post-war life was true reinvention, or simply stubborn continuation. Did she change, or did she merely polish her old role into something more palatable? What is clear is that she refused to repent, and in that refusal lay her strange kind of reinvention. She became the eternal defender of her past, a woman who turned scandal into her permanent identity. Unity, of course, never reinvented herself. Her attempted suicide left her crippled, her mind impaired. She returned to Britain, where her parents cared for her until her death in 1948. She lingered as a tragic ghost of the family, her story frozen in the Munich park, her reinvention denied by fate. If she survived in memory, it was only as the cautionary tale, the sister who had reached too far into the darkness and returned broken. Jessica's reinvention was radical. Widowed and stranded in America after Esmond Romilly's death, she built a new life, brick by brick. You imagine her in a cluttered Oakland apartment, children underfoot, typewriter rattling late into the night. She married Robert Treuhaft, a lawyer committed to civil rights and labour activism, and together they threw themselves into causes that reshaped mid-century America. Jessica's books, from Hons and Rebels to The American Way of Death, turned her into a journalist and social critic of international renown. A quirky detail. Jessica never quite shed her Mitford sense of humour, even as she exposed funeral industry greed or prison abuses. In interviews she laughed about her aristocratic roots, calling herself a red sheep among black ones. Her charm softened her radicalism, allowing her words to reach audiences who might otherwise recoil. Pamela, steady as ever, reinvented herself not through politics or literature but through domestic mastery. After her separation from Derek Jackson, she leaned into her passion for food and country life. She lived quietly, raising poultry, cooking feasts, and surrounding herself with rural pleasures. For Pamela, reinvention meant refusing drama. She turned away from the spotlight, and in doing so preserved her peace. Friends admired her as the least complicated of the sisters, though one suspects her quietness was its own form of rebellion. Debo, meanwhile, staged perhaps the most surprising reinvention of all. With Andrew Cavendish unexpectedly elevated to Duke of Devonshire after his brother's death, she became mistress of Chatsworth, a house crumbling under post-war taxes and neglect. Where others might have surrendered, Debo rolled up her sleeves. She transformed Chatsworth into a tourist attraction, opened farm shops, sold postcards, wrote books, and pioneered the model of the stately home as a business. Her reinvention was practical genius. She saved not only Chatsworth, but also the idea of living aristocracy, proving that grand houses could adapt to modern economies. Quirky tidbit: Debo adored Elvis Presley and proudly displayed her fandom. This detail made journalists chuckle, but it also endeared her to the public. Here was a duchess who was both guardian of a palace and fan of rock and roll. That combination made her unforgettable. The scholarly debate over the sisters' post-war lives asks whether they were shaped more by personal resilience or by the world's fascination with them. Did Nancy succeed because she was brilliant, or because readers couldn't resist novels that teased her scandalous family? Did Jessica thrive because of her activism, or because the novelty of an aristocrat turned communist guaranteed attention? Did Debo save Chatsworth out of genius, or because the public loved the idea of the Mitford Duchess? Perhaps both are true. The sisters' reinventions were part talent, part theatre, part the world's refusal to look away. You picture them scattered across the globe, Nancy sipping coffee in Paris, Diana polishing her image in France, Jessica pounding her typewriter in Oakland, Pamela fussing over hens, Debo marching briskly through Chatsworth's halls. They had survived war, scandal and division, and now each carved a niche. None faded quietly. Each found a way to matter. As you exhale, you realise this was the secret of the Mitfords, their capacity for reinvention. Even in disgrace, they managed to craft new stories for themselves, to turn failure into fascination. They remind you that identity is never fixed. It is written and rewritten, in ink, in action, in rumour, in memory. The laughter of their childhood games is still faintly audible beneath these reinventions, but it has changed. It is tinged with resilience, with the wisdom of survival, and so you drift deeper, hearing that laughter turn into the rustle of pages, the cluck of hens, the chatter of tourists, the speeches at rallies. The Mitfords lived on, each in her own chosen way, because none of them ever truly stopped performing. You settle deeper into the pillow, and now the air thickens with whispers. Not the crisp pages of Nancy's novels, or the strident pamphlets of Jessica, but the softer, slipperier hum of rumour. The Mitford sisters, already famous for their words and deeds, became something larger in the decades after their most scandalous moments passed. They became myth. Every anecdote, every slip of the tongue, every whispered quarrel around a dining table seemed to grow in size as it echoed outward. You cannot think of them without thinking of exaggeration. Sometimes their own, sometimes the press's, often both. Imagine picking up a newspaper in the 1960s, decades after Unity's suicide attempt, and still seeing her name invoked as Hitler's girl. Was it true she'd been in love with him? Had they shared private dinners? Had he called her my Valkyrie? Accounts differ. Unity herself, in her garbled post-injury state, never clarified. Hitler never left records about her beyond polite acknowledgements. Yet the myth remains, larger than the truth, and in its enormity she's remembered not as a complex woman, but as a caricature. The English debutante who adored the Führer. Nancy, too, contributed to the legend building. Her satire blurred the line between reality and fiction. When she wrote Uncle Matthew ranting about foreigners, readers laughed, and then assumed her father had been exactly so, without nuance. When she penned the Radlett sisters in The Pursuit of Love, everyone saw the Mitfords thinly veiled. Friends complained of being caricatured, yet Nancy's version of events stuck. She turned her family into characters, and once you become a character, myth attaches itself like ivy. A mainstream fact. The Mitford letters, eventually published in sprawling collections, cemented these myths. Readers saw their inside jokes, their cruel teasing, their contradictions, and took them at face value. The letters revealed truth, but also performance. The sisters always wrote with an audience in mind, even if that audience was one another. Quirky tidbit? The sisters loved exaggeration so much that they sometimes contradicted themselves within days. In one letter, Jessica declared she had sworn off aristocratic life forever. In another, she gushed about how much she missed the glamour. Diana insisted she cared only for Mosley's ideals, then joked about the cut of a uniform. Debo claimed she was thick as a brick, but then demonstrated dazzling business acumen. Their myths grew because they fed them. Historians still argue whether the Mitfords were truly extraordinary, or whether their legend is the result of endless storytelling. Were they genuinely more eccentric, more extreme than their peers, or were they simply better at marketing themselves, consciously or not, as unforgettable? Some suggest every aristocratic family of the era had its scandals, but only the Mitfords wrote them down, published them, and laughed about them in public. The act of self-documentation amplified their legend. The exaggerations range from the comic to the sinister. People whispered that Diana and Mosley had plotted with Hitler personally to broker peace, a claim never proven, but endlessly repeated. Unity was said to have introduced Hitler to English aristocrats. Possible, but more likely myth. Jessica was rumoured to have marched with American communists in disguise, though in truth she was often more journalist than activist. Even Debo was mythologized, the Duchess who saved Chatsworth single-handedly, when in reality she relied on a network of staff, advisors, and shifting economic tides. The truth was always complicated, but the myths were irresistible. You imagine them around a fire in later years, half smiling as they read their own clippings. Nancy might quip, "Well, darling, if they insist I said it, then I suppose I did." Jessica would roll her eyes, muttering that the bourgeois press lies. Diana would arch a brow, remarking that critics always twist loyalty into scandal. Debo would chuckle, adding another absurd headline to her scrapbook. Even in mockery they sustained the myth. Another quirky anecdote. Their private you and non-you language, originally just jokes about social class, was exaggerated by others into a sociolinguistic rulebook. Suddenly, linguists and journalists cited the Mitfords as authorities on aristocratic speech, when in truth they had only been playing a game. Their silliness became cultural myth. And then there is the enduring legend of their unity and eccentricity. People love to picture the 6 sisters gathered in one room, sparring, joking, embodying all extremes of politics and personality. The reality was that they were rarely together as adults, often estranged, sometimes years without speaking. Yet the myth of the Mitford Sisters persists, as if they were always a single dazzling ensemble cast. The scholarly debate continues. Is it right to indulge in these myths, or should we strip them away to see the women more clearly? Some historians argue that myth-making obscures their humanity, turning them into cartoons. Others say the myths are part of their story. The sisters created and relished exaggeration, and to strip it away would be to miss their essence. As you breathe slowly, you realise that myths are lullabies of history. They soothe with coherence, even when the truth is jagged. The Mitfords became legends not because they were consistent, but because they were contradictions wrapped in stories too good to resist. They were gossips of themselves, narrators of their own play, tricksters who blurred fact and fiction until no one could tell the difference. And so you drift into their myth world, where unity still haunts Hitler's circle, where Diana glitters in Paris salons, where Jessica waves a red flag, where Nancy scribbles satire, where Pamela feeds her hens, and where Debo counts postcard sales at Chatsworth. Whether true or not, the stories endure, and in that endurance lies their immortality. You roll into quieter territory now, where the roar of rallies and the clatter of prison keys fade into the rustle of pages. What survives most clearly of the Mitfords, beyond the scandals, beyond the politics, beyond the mockery, is their writing. The sisters were not merely characters in history, they were also its narrators. They left behind novels, memoirs, essays, and letters that form a chorus of voices, each distinct yet bound together by blood. Their literary output is both record and performance, equal parts truth and theatre, and it ensures that even decades after their deaths the Mitfords still speak. Begin with Nancy. She was the one who consciously transformed her family's life into art. The Pursuit of Love, 1945, and Love in a Cold Climate, 1949, are more than light social comedies. They are portraits of a world on the brink of extinction, a way of preserving the absurdity and charm of the aristocracy even as it crumbled. Her Uncle Matthew, based on their father, remains one of literature's great comic ogres, ranting about foreigners while doting awkwardly on his daughters. Nancy's genius was to take the details of her own life, the games, the slang, the rivalries, and immortalise them. Through her, the Mitfords became fictional archetypes, both admired and laughed at. A mainstream fact. The Pursuit of Love has never been out of print since its publication. It has been adapted multiple times for television, each new generation discovering Nancy's blend of satire and longing. This continuous revival proves the staying power of her prose. Quirky tidbit. Nancy wrote much of The Pursuit of Love while ill and confined to her bed, scribbling with feverish energy. She claimed later that writing was her medicine, her way of defying weakness. Readers, of course, never sensed her frailty, only the sparkle of wit. Jessica, too, contributed significantly to the literary legacy, though in a different register. Her memoir, Hons and Rebels, 1960, is a vivid, irreverent retelling of her childhood and her rebellion. It shocked and delighted in equal measure, exposing family eccentricities to a wider public. Where Nancy used fiction to disguise, Jessica used memoir to reveal. Later, Her The American Way of Death became a classic of investigative journalism, influencing public debate and even policy on the funeral industry. Through her words, she proved that laughter could be a scalpel, cutting into serious issues without losing sharpness. Historians still argue whether Jessica's books should be read as objective reporting or as political propaganda. Was The American Way of Death a balanced critique or a crusade in literary form? What is certain is that it succeeded in raising awareness, and it showcased her unique voice, blunt, funny, and morally urgent. Diana also left her mark in print. Her memoir, A Life of Contrasts, 1977, sought to reclaim her story, framing her choices as loyalty and principle rather than betrayal. Critics debated its honesty, but it became part of the record, ensuring her voice could not be silenced by her enemies. Whether admired or despised, her prose was elegant, controlled, and unapologetic. She understood that to write one's story is to seize power over memory. Unity never produced a body of literature, though her letters and notes survive. They are disturbing documents, filled with obsessive admiration for Hitler, peppered with swastikas doodled in margins. In their own way, they add to the Mitford archive, not as polished art, but as raw evidence of obsession. They remind readers of the extremes to which devotion can drive words. Pamela wrote sparingly, contributing to family letters and practical notes, yet her presence in the collective correspondence is vital. Her words ground the others, offering glimpses of country life, recipes, and quiet common sense. Her writing may not have been published in best-selling volumes, but it adds texture to the family record, proof that not all Mitfords were addicted to drama. Debo, the youngest, became an author in her own right, producing memoirs and books about Chatsworth. Wait for Me, 2010, published when she was 90, charmed readers with its brisk, humorous tone. She wrote not as a satirist or polemicist, but as a storyteller who invited readers into her world. Her books on country houses, food, and her beloved Elvis Presley furthered her reputation as the approachable Duchess. Her writing may not have shaken governments, but it delighted readers and preserved a unique slice of history. A quirky anecdote. Debo admitted that she struggled terribly with spelling and grammar. She joked that her editors deserved medals, yet her prose still sparkles, filled with warmth and wit. It proves that voice matters more than polish, that authenticity can trump technical skill. One of the richest aspects of the Mitford literary legacy is their letters, collected in volumes such as the Mitfords. Letters between 6 sisters, these correspondences reveal the full range of their voices: Nancy's biting wit, Jessica's political fury, Diana's elegance, Unity's obsession, Pamela's pragmatism, Debo's charm. Together they form an intimate portrait of a century, filtered through one eccentric family. The scholarly debate about these letters is whether they are reliable historical documents or performances designed for posterity. Did the sisters exaggerate in their letters, knowing they might one day be published? Certainly, they were inveterate show-offs, addicted to drama. But even if the letters are performances, they remain invaluable. They show how myth and memory were constructed in real time. Imagine the sisters across continents, Nancy in Paris, Jessica in California, Diana in Parisian exile, Debo at Chatsworth, yet still connected through ink. Letters flew back and forth, carrying gossip, mockery, accusations, and occasional affection. Reading them now feels like eavesdropping on a private play, each sister performing her role, yet also revealing more than she intended. Quirky tidbit. They often ended their letters with absurd sign-offs, mocking traditional closings. Jessica might write, "Yours in Revolution," while Nancy signed off with forever persecuting. Even their farewells were theatrical. The enduring literary legacy of the Mitfords lies not only in their individual works, but in their collective chorus. Together, they documented the 20th century from inside drawing rooms, prisons, rallies, kitchens, and estates. They made their lives readable, laughable, and unforgettable. Their words blur truth and fiction, but they keep the sisters alive on every page. As you drift deeper, you hear the scratch of their pens, the flutter of envelopes, the laughter between lines. Their books remain on shelves, their letters still quoted, their words ensuring that the Mitfords are not just remembered, but heard. In the end, ink became their immortality. You move now into the long twilight of the Mitford saga, where laughter softens and the sharp edges of scandal blur into memory. The sisters who once danced under chandeliers, shouted across dinner tables, and scribbled furious letters eventually grew old, frail, and silent. Yet even their departures became part of the myth. Death, for the Mitfords, was never a quiet footnote. It was another stage, another act in a play the world refused to stop watching. Nancy, eldest and sharpest, was the first to go. She had spent her last years in Paris, battling illness with the same mixture of wit and stubbornness she brought to everything else. Imagine her in her apartment on the Rue Monsieur, curtains drawn, a glass of champagne by the bedside, manuscripts and letters stacked untidily. In 1973 she succumbed to Hodgkin's lymphoma. Her passing was mourned not just by friends but by readers across Europe. Evelyn Waugh, who had admired and quarrelled with her in equal measure, wrote that she had made an art of malice. Her novels remained in print, and her legend as the Mitford who turned life into literature only grew. She was buried in Versailles, a final touch of drama befitting her love for France. Pamela, the quiet one, lived far longer. She remained in the countryside, tending to her dogs, gardens and kitchen. Her death in 1994 passed with little fanfare compared to her sisters, but those who knew her remembered her as the anchor, the steady hum beneath the family's storm. Friends recalled her generosity, her culinary skills, her no-nonsense humour. The world might have mocked her as the rural Mitford, but she left behind a quieter, humbler legacy. Proof that survival sometimes means stepping away from the spotlight. Diana outlived scandal, exile and imprisonment to die in 2003 at the age of 93. Even in her 90s she was elegant, her voice still calm, her memory sharp. She never repented of her fascist past, and so her obituaries divided sharply. Some praising her beauty and loyalty, others condemning her as an unrepentant fascist. Imagine her funeral, attended by admirers and critics alike, the air thick with ambivalence. She left behind not only her memoirs, but also her unyielding refusal to bend to history's judgment. Unity never had the chance to grow old. Her failed suicide attempt in Munich left her brain damaged, and she lived only a few years afterward, cared for by her parents. She died in 1948 from complications of her wound. Her death at 23 cemented her as the tragic figure of the family, the girl who loved Hitler too much, who returned from Germany a ghost, and whose story would forever be frozen at the edge of war. Her grave in Swinbrook is simple, a stark contrast to the outsized legend that haunts her name. Jessica, fiery rebel, lived until 1996. She died in Oakland, California, far from Swinbrook and Chatsworth. By then she was a respected author and activist, remembered for her exposés and her tireless fight for justice. At her memorial, fellow campaigners and writers gathered, reading passages from Hons and Rebels and the American Way of Death. Her ashes were scattered in the Pacific Ocean, a symbolic gesture of her chosen life far from the aristocratic world she had rejected. For Jessica, death was not a return to Mitford myth, but a continuation of her chosen exile. Debo, the youngest, outlived them all. She became the custodian of the Mitford legend, the last sister standing when she died in 2014 at the age of 94. She was mourned as the beloved Duchess of Devonshire, celebrated for saving Chatsworth, admired for her humour and humility. Her death marked the end of an era. With her passing, the Mitford sisters became history rather than living memory. A mainstream fact, all 6 sisters are buried, or memorialised within Britain, except Jessica, who chose America as her final home. The family graves in Swinbrook Churchyard contain Nancy, Diana, Unity and Pamela, their stones weathered by Oxfordshire rain. lying side by side in death as they rarely did in life. Visitors still come, leaving flowers, notes, even lipstick kisses on the stones. Quirky tidbit. Debau's funeral at Chatsworth included her favourite hymn and a reception with sausage rolls and champagne. She had insisted on the menu, wanting humour and hospitality to outlast solemnity. Mourners chuckled through tears, saying it was so very Debo. Even in death she shaped her narrative. Historians still argue about the afterlives of the sisters in cultural memory. Some see them as cautionary tales, women of privilege who wasted their talents in dangerous flirtations with ideology. Others see them as trailblazers, each refusing to conform, each carving an extreme path. Still others argue that they are best understood as entertainers, creatures of performance who turn their lives into theatre, leaving behind stories too outrageous to forget. What's clear is that their afterlives have been sustained through books, documentaries, films, and endless debates. Biographers revisit them constantly, fascinated by the contradictions. Were they frivolous or profound, loyal or treacherous, silly or brilliant? The arguments never end, and that endlessness keeps them alive. Quirky anecdote. In the decades after their deaths, fans began leaving Elvis trinkets at Debo's grave, red roses at Nancy's, political pamphlets at Jessica's, and even small swastikas, quickly removed, at Unita's. The sisters still attract devotion and outrage, proving that their afterlives are as theatrical as their lives. As you lie back, you picture the graves at Swinbrook, 6 stones in a row, quiet under the yews. The wind rustles, sheep graze nearby, and yet the silence hums with the voices of their quarrels, jokes, scandals. They are gone, but they are not. Their deaths did not end their story. They only sharpened the myths, froze the contradictions, and ensured that the Mitfords would never simply rest in peace. And so you drift in that churchyard dusk, the air cool, the stones damp, the echoes of laughter and shouting still faintly audible. Death did not silence the Mitfords. It turned them into legends, their afterlives brighter than most people's lives. You let out a slow breath, and what rises now is not the clink of glasses at a Mayfair ball, or the shuffle of boots in Holloway Prison, but the question that lingers like incense after a fire. Why do the Mitford sisters still command our imagination? They should, by all accounts, have faded into the dust of their era, another eccentric aristocratic family whose scandals are buried in archives. And yet, here you are, lying awake, listening to their voices echo through time. They haunt us not because they were consistent, but because they were contradictions made flesh, contradictions that mirror the century itself. The Mitfords embody extremes. In one family you find a fascist, a communist, a satirist, a rural recluse, a duchess, and a tragic devotee of Hitler. It is as if the 20th century compressed its entire spectrum of politics, literature, glamour, and tragedy into 6 daughters of a single household. Historians marvel at the unlikeliness of it. How could one dining table host arguments that mirrored the great battles of Europe? How could one set of sisters scatter so far across the ideological battlefield? That very extremity makes them irresistible, like a human kaleidoscope of the modern age. A mainstream fact supports this fascination. Biographers return to them again and again. Bookshelves sag under titles about the Mitfords. Television adaptations revisit Nancy's novels. Documentaries rehash Diana's scandals. Even today, their names are shorthand for aristocratic eccentricity and ideological division. Quirky tidbit? Readers and fans coined the phrase Mitford mania to describe the obsession. There are Mitford societies, tours of their childhood homes, even themed teas at Chatsworth where visitors sip Earl Grey while recounting which sister they most resemble. Few families inspire such playful devotion alongside such serious historical scrutiny. The scholarly debate is whether the Mitfords matter because of their deeds or because of the stories told about them. Were they genuinely influential in shaping politics and culture, or were they simply convenient symbols magnified by gossip and myth? Some scholars argue that their actual impact was limited, that Diana and Unity were more embarrassing curiosities than real political players, that Jessica's activism was earnest but hardly singular, that Nancy's novels, while brilliant, were society comedies rather than revolutionary texts. Others argue that their significance lies precisely in how they dramatise the century's extremes, making abstract ideologies feel personal and intimate. Part of the reason they haunt us is their humour. Even at their most divided, the sisters laughed, teased and exaggerated. Their letters sparkle with wit, their interviews bristle with jokes. Nancy turned their father into comic legend. Jessica mocked funeral directors with the same glee she mocked fascists. Debo laughed at her own supposed stupidity, then outsmarted everyone by saving Chatsworth. Humour made them accessible, even when their choices were appalling. We are drawn to them because they never stopped performing, never stopped entertaining. Another reason is their glamour. Photographs show them in gowns, riding horses, sipping cocktails in Paris cafes, standing beside men who shaped history. They were beautiful, poised, and impossibly stylish. Glamour lingers longer in memory than virtue. Even Unity, awkward and intense, had the height and presence that made her unforgettable. Glamour allows even the most scandalous lives to be mythologized. Yet beneath the glamour and humour, the sisters remind us of something darker, how easily privilege can twist into extremism. Their eccentricities were amusing when confined to chickens and slang, but devastating when channeled into fascism. They haunt us because they demonstrate that intelligence, beauty and wit do not guarantee wisdom. Their lives are cautionary tales dressed in sequins. Quirky anecdote. When asked late in life why the public remained obsessed, Debo quipped, "Because we are 6 for the price of 1. It saves trouble." She understood the appeal. 6 sisters, 6 archetypes, one endless story. And so their afterleaves continue. Nancy's novels are adapted yet again. Jessica's exposés inspire new generations of muckrakers. Diane's fascism sparks debates about complicity and glamour. Unity's tragedy provokes morbid fascination. Pamela's quietude reassures that not all must burn brightly. Debo's Chatsworth remains open, drawing millions who walk the halls she saved. The sisters linger not only in history books but in the living world, in literature, architecture, activism, and memory. As you breathe slower, you realise the Mitfords endure because they capture the paradox of the 20th century, a mix of comedy and horror, privilege and poverty, glamour and ruin. They remind us that history is not neat. It is messy, contradictory, human, and sometimes absurd. The image fades now. 6 sisters at a long table, each looking in a different direction. One laughs, one plots, one writes, one stares dreamily, one fusses over hens, one hums with determination. They quarrel, they joke, they love, they betray. And even as the lights dim, you cannot forget them. And now, as the last echoes of the Mitford Sisters fade, you feel the pace of the story soften. The scandals, the quarrels, the laughter and sorrow, all dissolve into a gentler rhythm. You picture the Oxfordshire countryside at dusk, sheep grazing in quiet fields, the wind moving softly through the hedges. In a small churchyard at Swinbrook, the stones of 4 sisters lie side by side, simple and still. The world that once rushed to their every word has grown hushed, leaving only the sound of the evening breeze. The clamour of politics and the glare of flashbulbs no longer matter here. What remains are fragments. A witty sentence, a flash of beauty in a ballroom, a letter folded and refolded, a chuckle over a private joke. These fragments float like fireflies in the dark, faint but persistent, lighting the air with memory. You let yourself sink further, and the quarrels no longer seem fierce, only human. Sisters arguing at a table, mocking one another, laughing too loudly, holding grudges too long, yet still bound by something that never quite breaks. They remind you that history is not only kings and wars, it is also families, messy and tender, contradictory and unforgettable. The night stretches out, long and quiet. Imagine closing the great doors of Chatsworth, the lights going out one by one, the room settling into silence. Somewhere, far away, a record spins softly, an Elvis tune floating through the stillness. You breathe with it, slower, deeper, letting go. And so the story rests now. The sisters are gone, their myths told, their voices fading to whispers. All that's left is the quiet hum of the night, wrapping you like a blanket, carrying you gently towards sleep.